The heat in Tulsa that summer seemed determined to linger, heavy with the scent of iron and tar. The war was over, and everyone said the country was healing. Soldiers coming home, factories booming again, flags on every porch. But on East 21st Street, beneath the crooked shadow of a pecan tree, there stood a house that never quite joined the celebration. Clara Evans first saw it on a Tuesday afternoon. She had been walking from the bus stop, suitcase in hand, sweat darkening the collar of her cream blouse. Her new employer, Mrs. Nancy Foreman, had sent a letter weeks earlier. A private residence seeking quiet domestic help, room, board, and wages fair. Discretion appreciated. Clara needed the job. The boarding house she'd been staying at was closing, and the war work in the munitions factory had dried up. So she took the long road to East 21st Street, where the sidewalks cracked and the weeds pressed through like old bones. The Hex House wasn't much from the outside. 2 stories, narrow, with paint the color of ashes and windows curtained too tightly for sunlight. A single white cat watched her from the porch rail as she climbed the steps. When the door opened, it was not Mrs. Foreman who greeted her, but a thin woman with hair pinned so tightly it pulled her face into a permanent expression of strain. "You must be Miss Evans," the woman said. "I'm Mrs. Foreman's companion, Evelyn." Her eyes flicked over Clara's clothes, her shoes, the suitcase. "You'll find we keep to order here. Mrs. Foreman prefers a quiet home." Clara followed her into a narrow hallway lined with family photographs that didn't quite match. Different styles, different decades. Some were faded so completely the faces had blurred to ghosts. A clock ticked somewhere deep in the house, slow and uneven. In the parlor, Mrs. Foreman waited in a high-backed chair. She was not what Clara had imagined. Not old exactly, but ageless in a way that made her skin crawl. Her hair was the color of paper ash, and she wore a dress too fine for an afternoon at home. "Miss Evans," she said, her voice smooth as syrup. "I'm glad you came." Something about her tone made Clara straighten. It wasn't quite a greeting, more like a statement of ownership. They talked about duties, cleaning, meals, tending to the downstairs room. No guests, no visitors. A strict schedule. Payment in cash. It all seemed normal enough until Mrs. Foreman asked, "Do you believe in obedience, Miss Evans?" Clara hesitated. "I suppose so, ma'am. I believe in doing what's right." Mrs. Foreman's smile widened. "Good. You'll fit in fine." That night, Clara was given a small room upstairs. Sparse but clean. The wallpaper had a pattern of twisting vines that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. From somewhere below, she could hear a soft humming. A woman's voice, low and rhythmic. Evelyn had disappeared after dinner, saying only, "Mrs. Foreman doesn't like noise after dark." Clara lay awake, listening. At midnight, the humming stopped. In its place came a sound like whispering, faint but close, as if from inside the walls. She sat up, holding her breath. "Hello!" No answer. But the whispering seemed to move, down the hall, toward Mrs. Foreman's room. Clara told herself it was the wind, or old pipes. Houses made noises, especially old ones. But when she finally fell asleep, her dreams were full of voices repeating her name in a language she didn't understand. In the morning, Mrs. Foreman was already in the kitchen, a kettle steaming beside her. "Sleep well?" she asked. Clara nodded, though her eyes felt heavy. "Good," said Mrs. Foreman. "We'll be performing a cleansing tonight. You'll assist." "A cleansing?" Mrs. Foreman stirred her tea slowly. "This house holds memories, Miss Evans. Shadows from before the war. I keep them in order. That's why it stands." She looked up, eyes sharp as glass. "You'll help me keep it that way, won't you?" Clara wanted to ask what that meant, but something in the woman's gaze froze her tongue. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. That evening, as the sun went down, Evelyn brought Clara a candle and a length of white ribbon. "For the ceremony," she said, "do not speak unless spoken to." They gathered in the basement, a place Clara hadn't been allowed before. The air was damp, smelling of salt and something metallic. The walls were lined with jars filled with cloudy water and small shapes floating inside. Mrs. Foreman stood before an old trunk, her hands raised. "The house remembers," she intoned. "The house protects. We give it what it needs." Evelyn began to hum again, the same tune Clara had heard the night before. Mrs. Foreman turned to her. "Tie the ribbon, Miss Evans. Around your wrist." Clara did. The fabric was cold as ice. "Now," said Mrs. Foreman softly. "Say the words." I don't know them." Mrs. Foreman smiled. "You will." And then, as if the air itself bent around her, Clara did know them. Strange syllables that rolled off her tongue like she'd spoken them all her life. The candle flame shuddered. The jars on the shelves began to rattle. When it was over, Mrs. Foreman placed a hand on her cheek. "Good girl," she whispered. "You belong here now." Clara wanted to pull away, but her body wouldn't move. Above them, the house creaked. A long, low groan like something waking from sleep. For 3 days after the cleansing, the house was silent. Too silent. Clara moved through her chores as if underwater. Her mind fogged, her heartbeat slow. Each morning, Mrs. Foreman handed her a small glass of pale liquid that smelled faintly of camphor. "For your constitution," she said. Clara drank because refusing felt unthinkable. Afterward, the world seemed muffled, colors dulled. Time softened around the edges. Evelyn rarely spoke now. She floated from room to room, face expressionless, humming that same circular tune that had echoed in the basement. Sometimes Clara caught her standing at the top of the stairs, staring into the shadows below as if waiting for someone to come up. At night, the whispers returned. They seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her breath. Not words, but intent. Once, half dreaming, she pressed her ear against the wallpaper and swore she heard her own name whispered back with a sigh of recognition. On the 4th morning, the front door opened for the first time since Clara had arrived. The light outside was so bright she squinted. Mrs. Foreman stood on the threshold, speaking in low tones to a man in a gray delivery uniform. He looked nervous, eyes darting around as if something in the air pressed on his lungs. He handed her a parcel wrapped in brown paper and backed away quickly. When the door shut, Mrs. Foreman caught Clara watching. "You'll help me store this below," she said. The package was heavier than it looked. As Clara carried it down to the basement, she noticed the jars had been rearranged. A few new ones sat on a lower shelf, the liquid inside clearer, the shapes within more defined. She thought she saw a small hand pressed against the glass before the light shifted. Mrs. Foreman took the parcel from her and knelt beside the old trunk. The smell that rose when she opened it was not of mothballs or cedar, but of wet earth and iron. Inside were objects wrapped in linen. A cracked mirror, a rosary without a cross, a handful of what looked like teeth. "Every house keeps its secrets," Mrs. Foreman murmured. "But this one remembers all who disobey." That evening, Clara found a note slipped under her door in a shaky hand. "Don't drink what she gives you. The walls hear everything." She looked down the hall. Evelyn's door was closed, but she thought she saw light flickering beneath it, moving as though from several candles. Clara poured the next morning's tonic down the wash basin. By midday, the fog in her mind began to lift. The edges of the world sharpened again, and what she saw made her blood chill. The photographs in the hallway had changed. The faces were clearer now, and one of them, a young woman in a simple dress, hands folded, looked exactly like her. The frame's brass plate read Clara Evans, 1943. Her breath caught. She hadn't been here in 1943. She hadn't even been in Tulsa. When she turned, Mrs. Foreman was standing behind her. "Curious thing, memory," she said softly. "A house can borrow yours if it likes. All it needs is a willing tongue to speak its name." That night Clara pretended to sleep. Through the crack in her door, she saw shadows move past. Mrs. Foreman first, then Evelyn, both carrying candles. She followed them barefoot, each step slow and deliberate, down the narrow hall, through the kitchen, and into the cellar. The chanting had begun again. The same rhythm as before, but slower, more deliberate. Clara hid behind the stair post, watching. Mrs. Foreman stood before the trunk. Evelyn knelt beside her, ribbon around her wrist, head bowed. House of salt, house of memory, Mrs. Foreman intoned. Bind the soul that would flee. Evelyn's voice trembled as she repeated the words. The candlelight wavered, shadows stretching long across the walls. Then Mrs. Foreman drew a small blade from the folds of her dress and pricked Evelyn's finger. A drop of blood fell onto the white ribbon. It hissed like oil on flame. Evelyn gasped, not from pain but release. "Thank you, mistress," she whispered. Mrs. Foreman smiled, proud and cold. "You are kept. The house holds you." Clara stumbled back, the step creaking underfoot. The two women froze. "Who's there?" Her breath caught. Mrs. Foreman's candle lifted. Its flame bent toward the stairs like a snake tasting the air. "Come down, Miss Evans," she said, almost kindly. "No need to hide from what you already are." Clara ran. Up the stairs, through the hall, into her room, slamming the door and throwing the latch. The whispers exploded around her. Furious now, the vines on the wallpaper seeming to writhe. She pressed her hands over her ears and whispered a prayer. Any prayer, until exhaustion dragged her into shallow sleep. At dawn, Evelyn was gone. Her room was stripped bare, bed neatly made. No trace she had ever existed. Mrs. Foreman served breakfast as usual, humming under her breath. "Evelyn decided to move on," she said when Clara asked. "The house has a way of giving people what they need." Clara forced a smile. "And what does it need from me, Mrs. Foreman?" The older woman's eyes glittered. "You'll know soon. Every house must have a heart, Miss Evans. I think you'll make a fine one." That afternoon, the doorbell rang again. This time, a young pastor stood there, hat in hand. "Ma'am," he said politely, "I've come by on behalf of St. Anthony's. We were hoping you'd allow us to bless your home." Mrs. Foreman's expression didn't change, but the air in the room tightened like a held breath. "That won't be necessary," she said. "It's only tradition, ma'am. Some of the neighbors." I said no. Then, faintly, she heard Evelyn's humming again. But it wasn't coming from the basement this time. It was coming from inside the hallway wall, just behind the photograph of Clara Evans, 1943. The storm broke just before dawn. Thunder rolled across the sky like something ancient turning in its sleep. The house trembled with every flash of lightning. Clara had spent the night hiding in the parlor, clutching the old photograph of herself. She could still hear the tapping inside the walls, patient, rhythmic, deliberate. Evelyn's voice had joined it now, soft as a lullaby. "House of salt, house of memory." Each repetition made the air feel heavier. The house was breathing. She could feel it through the floorboards. She had to leave. Now, she grabbed her coat and ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The lock turned, the knob rattled, but the wood held firm as if fused to the frame. The windows wouldn't budge either. Behind her, the grandfather clock began to tick again, loud, steady, matching her heartbeat. Mrs. Foreman's voice came from the stairwell. "You shouldn't run, Clara. The house doesn't like it when things try to leave." Clara turned. Mrs. Foreman stood in her nightgown, pale hair loose, candle in hand. Her eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but reflection, as though something else were staring out through her. "What do you want from me?" Clara gasped. Mrs. Foreman smiled, tender and terrifying. "You've already given it. Every breath you've taken here, every whisper you've heard, it belongs to the house now. To me." The candle flickered out. The dark closed in. Clara stumbled backward until her hand brushed the parlor wall. Beneath the wallpaper, she felt movement, a slow pulse, like a living thing. The vines in the pattern were shifting, curling toward her touch. Lightning flashed, illuminating the photographs along the hallway. There were more now, dozens, hundreds, every face identical to hers, Clara after Clara, year after year. She screamed. Mrs. Foreman's voice came from everywhere at once. "It remembers what it loves. That's why it keeps you." The house waited.